Have any question on any of the previous topics we have covered so far?
No, not
No.
yet.
So when you hear of app integration, and from the prerequisite that you have gone through Okta basic videos, what did you understand about an app integration or app onboarding with Okta?
They're not all the profile attributes are not all included, just like the way in AD it is. And that's why sometimes we have to use AD in there, but there's a lot of, we can use CVS files to add in all of different contacts or different users into accounts. And yeah.
And how is it related with app onboarding?
I'm a little confused. What's the difference between app integration? When you're integrating the app, aren't you onboarding it into your Okta tenant?
Yes.
Okay.
So integration / onboarding, that is a same activity. Or often you will hear the term called federation or federating.
I remember hearing that in those videos. Is federating like just setting the rules or guidelines for how the app can be used, who can use the app?
No. So federating is like just making a way of two different third-party systems interact with each other. So let's say you have an application, right? Let's say the application is Salesforce. So how will Salesforce interact with Okta and can use Okta services? Now the services can be anything which Okta provide, and how Okta can provide a service or can use a service from Salesforce. So this way of connecting two different systems together is called federation.
Makes sense.
So in the Okta basic curriculum video, did they show you anything with app integration? Or do you know what is a core feature of Okta that it is very famous about, and it is used? The other features which we see differently is part of Okta, but the main feature of Okta, what is Okta?
The single sign-on features and the SWA feature.
Okay. So let's talk about single sign-on. So what do you understand by single sign-on?
That many apps can be connected together through one email address and one password. So they don't have to put in like different email addresses and different passwords for different kinds of email, different kinds of websites and different apps that they would use.
And what will be that binding force? How will they get connected? Like, what do you think? Who is connecting them together?
I'm assuming in some cases it would be like they could use Okta software, or like, for example, the one I'm used to is maybe in a lot of websites, like Google single sign-on, I just use the Google account for everything. So that security feature.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. So yeah, the core product of Okta, or the core feature of Okta, is single sign-on. And the way single sign-on works is you have one credential. That's why it's called like single sign-on, right? So you have one credential. You need to log into one system. Once you are logged into one system, let's say that system is Okta in our reference, then you can easily access any other application you are entitled to or any other system you're entitled to without further re-authentication. So let's say if you wanted to log into 5 different applications, Facebook, Twitter, and all, you have to like literally put in the username and password 5 different times, and those username and password can be different, right? It is not required for them to be same. So similarly, in an enterprise, you will see that when you are working on any job role, you would be at minimum accessing 5 to 6 different applications. And those applications definitely comes from different vendors. It's not coming from everything cannot come from one vendor, right? Even though Microsoft is a very big software company, Microsoft is not the only software company, right? There are so many other software companies, and they are also making softwares which is used in an enterprise, right? So you will see that for your, let's say you're working as a graphics designer, so you will use one tool from Adobe, right? Or let's say 2 to 3 products from Adobe. You can use another product from AutoCAD, right? So you can use another system for some sketching, like Figma. You can use Figma for your sketching, and you would definitely log into a computer. So you're logging into the Active Directory services. Then you would be accessing printers. That is another service, right? So at any point of time, you would minimum log into 5 to 6 different application, regardless of whatever role you are at, right? So for these 5 to 6 password to be maintained, or for you to remember all these 5 to 6 passwords, and in an organization, there is a very good thing is you have to rotate your password every 60 days or 90 days. So every 60 days or 90 days, they will force you to change your password, not just for one system, for each and every system. So if you keep on changing the password and they will not let you use last 6 password or last 8 passwords, how would you going to go to remember all of these passwords? The one way I can think of is writing that in a notepad or in an Excel sheet, right? That's a very common practice I have seen in employees. They put their password in an Excel sheet or in a notepad, and whenever they need to access that application, they open the notepad. But do you think it's secure?
No, because it
No.
could be hid or hacked or lost.
How about sticky notes?
Yeah, same reason.
Same reason.
I'm not talking about the computer sticky note, the
Yeah.
literal physical.
Yeah, even physical one, they could be thrown in the garbage. It could get lost.
Correct. And they can be seen even from a distance. I can see a sticky note attached to your desk and I can see the password username on that, right? So that is not a secure method. So what we do is we give them a burden of remembering only one password. Not 100 password, not 5 passwords, only one password and one username. And based on that, you can access n number of services your organization has to offer. So you don't need to remember any other username password for any other application. Just remember one, and all other services would be available to you with the same username and password. Definitely, we would need to make some arrangement, and that arrangement is Okta. So Okta plays a vital role here to connect all of these applications so that they can use a single credential. And how it happens? So there are 2 roles which is created. One is called as an identity provider, and the second role is called as a service provider. So you as a user want to access something from Salesforce, from GitHub, from Google, Gmail, Office 365, right? So these are the software vendors which have some service to offer, like Gmail, Outlook, they offer you an email as a service. Then if we go for Adobe products, they offer you graphic designing services, right? And so on. So these softwares or applications provide you some kind of service, and they are referred to as a service provider. So you want to utilize their services. Now, in order to utilize the services, they need authentication from you because they just cannot let you use it until you're authenticated. So they need authentication. Now, as we have discussed just right now, that we have made some arrangement with all these software vendors that we are going to use a single credential. So there has to be some common grounds which every application can understand. So it is like I need to share I need to have some way of telling Adobe, Microsoft, and everyone that this is the credential, right? So that job will be taken care by Okta, and Okta will become an identity provider. So Okta will be sharing your identity with these different applications. So whenever you want to access Outlook, Okta will share your identity with Microsoft Office 365, and then you can access any services from Microsoft Office 365, including Outlook or Word, PowerPoint, anything. Similarly, when you want to access Gmail, then then Okta will share your identity to Gmail. So Google knows who is authenticating, what is your email address, right? So the Google will be able to identify all of this information, and Okta will be sharing these identity information to these service providers. So Okta will play the role of a identity provider, and your identities will be stored in Okta. Similarly, what you have seen, right, in directory people, we store these users. The reason we store these users so that Okta can share these information with these service providers. And Okta plays the role of identity provider in that sense. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's think of one term. So we know Okta is an identity provider and these applications are service provider. Now every application is developed by different developers. Every developer develops in their own style. So I spoke about some arrangement which has to be make some common ground, right? So what are those common grounds? So there are some rules or a path which is set that this will be the way I can transfer the identity, or I can share the identity of the user from Okta to these applications. So those paths or those rules are called as protocols, right? Those are called single sign-on protocols. And we have two protocols in common. One is SAML, which stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, and another one is OIDC, which is Open Identity. Yeah, I think Open Identity Connect. That is OIDC, or some people also call it OAuth. These are two different things, but we combined use OIDC, OAuth together. So if you hear OAuth from someone or OIDC from someone, don't get confused. For us, it is OIDC, which is Open ID Connect, and SAML. So these are the two protocols or two different rules we can set up to share your identity from Okta to these different applications. So today we are going to discuss on the first one, which is SAML, and we will see how SAML works. Okay.
Got it. Are we going to use that what is that called? That that thing that we downloaded, the SAML tracer extension. Are we going to be using that? Okay.
When did you download it?
I think it was in the prerequisites, or you told us in one of the classes to make sure we download it.
I don't think we had any time use of SAML tracer in our previous session. So I think, yeah, it is part of prerequisites for sure.
Yeah, it's probably part of the prerequisites then.
SAML, that's a very big term, right? Have you heard of this word before in your basic curriculum?
Yeah, just the early curriculum that we were doing. Yeah.
Okay. And what have you understood of SAML from your basic curriculum?
It's under identity federation, so it's between organizations. So it's a standard protocol that it's basically used for SSO.
Okay. So what does that protocol, like what is the role of that protocol?
It allows the same identity to be used across like different systems and different domains.
Okay. Go ahead. Any other information that you know about SAML?
I remember learning something about there's three parts to a SAML, but I don't remember it in detail.
Okay. All right, so let's first define the term itself, SAML. Can anyone tell me the definition? I think the full form of SAML. I just said a few minutes before, but let's see if you remember.
Security Assertion Markup Language.
Markup language.
Right. So we all know what is a security. What is an assertion?
To add in something.
We make assertive statements, right? This is it. So assertion, yeah, it is to add something or to assert something or to confirm something, right? So, and we just discussed what Okta shares. Okta shares the identity information from its directory to the application. So it's asserting your identity information to the application. And it is used for security purpose, for authentication and authorization. And markup language is a way of representing data in a digital form. So if you have access to websites before, like google.com, right? I believe everybody has access to google.com or any other website. So these websites uses a technology called HTML. Okay. And HTML is also markup language. It's called as a hypertext markup language. So markup language is where we define the components in this way, like this is one component called div, right? So we are defining the component in a style which is called as a markup style. And these are not called as a programming languages. These are called as scripts or scripting. It's not even scripting, basically. These are just a way of representing text, right? So we are representing text in a special way so that we know what that specific component is and how it should look like. So if you have done any programming before, or if you're familiar with HTML, the way SAML looks will be very familiar to you. If you have not done, there is no need to do it, and you should still be able to understand. So this is a full form of SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language, and Okta is the asserting member or the identity provider in this scenario. This is a user. Everything would start here with user. There has to be a user who is initiating authentication, right? Who we are authenticating, who is accessing the product, an application. Is it a user or somebody else?
Most of the time it's a user, but it could be like another device, like a printer.
Yeah.
But it's a user, right?
So will we consider printer as a user? Can we consider printer as a user?
No, I don't think so.
Why? Who is using that service?
It's usually a human, but I remember you saying that it could
No,
be.
but
Hmm.
yeah, so yeah, usually it's a human. But if printer is using a service, isn't printer the user?
Yeah, I understand. Yes, it is considered a user. Could be a robot, it could be a printer, it could be some device. So they're all considered users, right?
Correct. Swan. You would have to give me a few minutes while I'm trying to draw an application.
So are you doing this in SAML somewhere? Because it says SAML on top.
No, that's just a text. This is called draw.io. This is a drawing tool. I'm drawing it for you so that I can explain you things visually instead of just talking about it.
Yeah, got it.
Okay. All right. So this is Okta. This is user. This is an application, right? What is the intent here? User would like to access this application. Sorry. So this user might like to access. Yeah, let's put the user in center. Yeah, so this user would like to access this application. This application does not to authentication on its own or relies on authentication from Okta. And Okta's job is to share the authentication details to this application, so this application knows who you are. So when this user would like to access this application, let's say this application is Office 365. Do we all know what is an Office 365? Yes,
Yeah.
no, maybe.
Yes, you read it.
Okay. So let's say this is Office 365, and this user would like to access Office 365, which provides him access to his emails, Teams, Skype, and everything, right? Now, as we have told Office 365 that our company or our organization is using Okta or any identity provider. So we don't want Office 365 or Microsoft to authenticate you directly. They should always rely on Okta. That's the only way we can achieve single sign-on, right? We can have a single credential. If Microsoft does its own authentication, if Adobe does its own authentication, then Microsoft may have a different username, Adobe may have a different username. Then we can never achieve this functionality of single sign-on. So the only way we can achieve a single sign-on is by instructing these software applications not to use their own method of authentication, but to rely on an identity provider like Okta. So that is the goal. So we tell this to all the application in our organization, not to use your own authentication method, but to check with Okta, and Okta will let you know how to do the authentication. So when this user want to access Office 365, Office 365 will simply visit Okta because Okta is acting as an identity provider, and it will request Okta to provide information about the user or to process the user authentication. This step is called as request. So application is requesting Okta to initiate authentication process. User went to application, okay? So there is one initiation from user, but this is not counted. Let's say we are not counting it, okay? Application does not know who the user is until the user is authenticated, but application cannot do an authentication of its own. That's a limitation. So what application does is application goes to Okta, makes a request and says somebody wants to access my services. Can you do the authentication on my behalf? So Okta as an identity provider would do the authentication. Once the authentication is completed, Okta then knows who you are, right? Because you have put your username, password, MFA, and whatnot. So Okta has concept or idea about who the user is. Hold on. And then once Okta knows who you are, Okta have every information about you. It knows your first name, last name, email address, phone number, right? So Okta can package those information in a single file and can share it with the application. That is called as response. Okay. So application would request Okta for authentication. Once the authentication is successful by Okta, then Okta would send a response to these application with your identity information. Now, once the application receives this response, once application has your identity information, it has your email address, first name, last name, application also knows who you are. Then application can check if you should have access to this service or not. And if you should, then application can let you log in. This is the whole concept of single sign-on.
Hey, Sumit.
Mhm.
The security, the SAML part, is that when like, okay, so the user goes to Office 365, Office 365 redirects them to Okta to enter their credentials. And then when they enter that credentials, that's when Okta uses SAML to send the response? Or is it sending the request and the response in SAML?
So sending the request would also be included in the SAML. So the SAML process would begin as soon as application initiates a request.
Okay, so as soon as the user uses his organization email in add Office 365, that's when SAML kicks in.
Correct. So as soon as user hits the application, let's say he want to access Office 365, so he goes to Office 365. Now, what is the first thing any application would do? They would present you with a login page, right? Let's say ignore the home page, landing page, and their promotional pages, right? So the very first thing in order to access any application is to authenticate. So they would present a login page. But we have restricted these applications not to use their own authentication mechanism. So what should they do is they should some way identify your organization and send you to the identity provider your organization has installed. Let's say our organization has used Okta as an identity provider. So they would redirect you to the Okta for this organization. And then Okta knows how to authenticate you, whether it's username, password, MFA. Once that process is done, then Okta also has a responsibility of sending these authentication information to the application. So application also knows who you are, not just Okta. And then that's where the process would complete. So it's like a cycle. No question?
No question.
No.
Okay.
No.
So any authentication flow would be similar. Not just SAML, even OIDC would be in a similar format, right? So this arrows does not represent SAML. SAML is the information which is sent in the request and in the response. The way it is sent is SAML, right? So now I just told you application request, but application is not a human, right? So they cannot just make a call to Okta and say, hey, authenticate the user, right? So there has to be some digital way of representing that request. And it can be a file which application can share. It can be a URL, an application can make a call or redirect the user. It can be a message which can be sent to Okta from application. So this has to be done in some way. There has to be some transport mechanism involved, right? That transport mechanism and the format of the data which an application shares during the request and which Okta shares during the response is SAML, okay? So when application makes a request, application has to share some details about it. How would Okta know which application has made a request? If I receive a phone call from an unknown number and I don't recognize a voice, or let's say everybody in this world sounds similar, how would I know who has called? So there has to be a way to identify the person, right?
Right. It would
Yeah.
be either through caller ID or that identity that would show up on the phone.
Yeah, let's say it's an unknown number, so I don't see any identity information when you call. So what is my first thing to do to identify you?
Google the phone number.
While you are on the call, I'll say hello, and then I'll say, wait, let me Google, and then, oh, is this Irfan?
I'm just
First and
joking.
last name.
I would ask you, right? That's a very basic thing. Hey, who's calling, right?
Right.
If I don't have your, like, if I don't recognize your voice, if I don't recognize your number, if I don't know who's calling, I can ask who's calling and what is it regarding, right? That's a very basic thing we do. And then we know the purpose of the call, who is the caller, and then we can serve them the content which they want, or we can use our brain to decide what to do next. Similarly, when this application makes a request to Okta, application has to share its own identification with Okta. So the Okta knows who's making a request and why they're making a request. So why they're making a request is known. They are making a request to authenticate the user. That will be fixed for all the application. Now, who is making this request is a way to identify this application. We identify the application using a unique information called as entity ID. So each and every application would have a value or name called entity ID. Okay, so entity ID is name to the applications. Some applications can use their URL as entity ID because, of course, Salesforce.com will be unique to Salesforce as a product. Microsoft cannot use Salesforce.com URL, right? They would have Microsoft.com or Apple.com for Apple. So URLs are in most general cases a very unique information to the product. But there can be other type of information, like it can be just a text, like my name. My name is Sumit. It's not a URL, right? I'm not saying sumit.com or anything. So my name is Sumit. That's also information. That's a way you can identify me, given that you don't know multiple Sumits, right? If you know multiple Sumits, then I can include my last name as well. And if you know a person with the same last name and first name, then I have to include some other information. But there are multiple ways of identifying or naming something. So entity ID is nothing, but it's a unique name for this application. So when application makes a request, they would provide this value in the request, and Okta can identify this application uniquely whenever they see this value called entity ID. Okay. So let's say for Office 365, it is HTTPS office.com, which is not. Office uses a very unique way of naming their application, but for simplicity, let's say they are using office.com as their name. So when Okta receives a request and request says the entity ID is office.com, Okta immediately identifies this is coming from Office 365. Any question?
No.
No.
Okay. So let's say you are writing a letter to your friend or to someone. What, apart from the main content of the letter itself, what else would you include so that it is sent to the right place, the recipient is right, and the recipient can identify you?
Address.
Address of who's your address? Whose address will be
The
mentioned?
recipients, the person who I'm sending it to.
Okay. So destination address, okay. What other information would you include?
First and last name, country.
Okay. Yourself? Again, let's say that you include the recipient address, name, phone number, everything, right? How would I know from where this letter has arrived? Who has sent this letter? How would I reply back to this letter?
Yeah, the
My-
person sending it has to put in their
Also-
first last name and address, all of that as well.
Right. So the sender also has to specify their information. Sometimes it's just first name, last name, phone number. Sometimes you also need to include address and so on, right? So you have to specify both the sender's information and the recipient information. Similarly, when application makes a request, it will definitely send its own identification, like the entity ID, which is its unique way of naming the application itself. And then it will also send the destination. How would the message or the request know where to go? So there has to be a way, there has to be a destination, right, for this message to go to or to be sent. So in the request, application would also include the destination address. Now, in a digital form, we know that any form of address is just URL, right? Or an IP address. So here, application would include the URL of Okta, and not just any URL of Okta. There is a specific URL from Okta called as single sign-on URL. So it will include single sign-on URL of Okta, and that is categorized as destination in the request. In short, I'll type SSO URL.
I see.
What else? you said that when you send the letter, you also write your address, right? So as a recipient, I can reply back to you on that same address. So here also, you would share your address, but this is like not a letter to your friend, right? This is a letter for authentication. And what app wants in return is user information, right? As a response. So the application would also need to tell Okta where they want this information to be sent. An application can have an n number of URLs. They can have a login URL, they can have a homepage URL, they can have a contact us URL, they can have a logout URL. So there can be n number of URLs which can do some specific functions, right? So application would also have a dedicated URL, like how destination has a SSO URL, a single sign-on URL. So application would also have a specific dedicated URL just to receive these kind of responses from identity providers or Okta. That is called as ACS URL. The full form of ACS is Assertion Consumer Service URL. So we all know SAML stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. Assertion is nothing but just you, as you say, adding information or asserting that what I'm saying is like it's just as a statement, right? So Okta would make a statement that this is a user, this is his name, this is his first name, last name, whatever, right? So these kind of statements when will be made, somebody has to receive this or consume this kind of assertions, and that will be the application. So there will be a dedicated URL from the application just to consume these kind of assertions or responses from Okta, and that is named as assertion consumer service. Okay, this URL would only belong to an application or a service provider. It will not belong to an identity provider, and single sign-on URL where apps can make a request would only belong to an identity provider and not to a service provider. Okay. Entity ID is a way of naming this application. Similarly, an application can have multiple identity providers. So now if we reverse the role, let's look from an application perspective. I am Adobe, right? Now, as a company, Adobe, I'm not selling my product only to one company, but I'm selling my product to hundreds of companies, right? So when this kind of response arrives from your organization, and it also arrives from 100 different organizations, how would my application know which organization has sent this response, or which identity provider has sent this response? So there has to be some way of identifying the identity providers as well, right? Because we are in a SaaS world. SaaS, it means software as a service. So we create one application. We are not installing applications anymore on our computer, right? We're creating web applications or applications on a service, and you are just using that application without employing your own infrastructure. So you're just using the application on cloud. So when the applications are on cloud, the same applications are distributed to 100 different participants, right? I purchase Gmail, you purchase Gmail, and 1,000 other people use Gmail. So we are not installing Gmail somewhere on our computer. So it's not a dedicated service for us. It's the same service being distributed to different people. So when you want to authenticate or access, or an email arrives for you, so there has to be some way of identifying who has this email been arrived for, right? Or who has sent this email. So similarly, when response arrive to an application also has to have a way of identifying the identity provider, and then it can decide what to do next once a response has arrived. So similar to this information, which is included in the response, sorry, in the request, I'll just group them together. Let's say they are part of request. So similar to this information, you will also have some information sent in the response. So one common information which you see in the response is naming the identity provider. That is also called as entity ID itself. Okay, so here instead of office.com, you will have the entity ID of Okta, which is your identity provider. So it will have, let's say, okta.com. Okay. Yes, no, maybe any question?
No questions.
No.
Okay. Now, here, also Okta is sending a message to someone, so there has to be a destination, but that is not called as destination in SAML terms. That is called as audience. So who should be receiving this message or response? That is again, where did application wanted the assertion to arrive?
Adobe.
No. Where did the application wanted the message from Okta to arrive? It was included in the request to send the assertion at this endpoint of application.
Sorry, I probably missed that. I don't know.
Assertion consumer service, right? So it included in the request that this is the location of the application or the URL of the application where Okta should be sending the assertion or this response, right? So here the response is sent, or let's say the destination becomes your assertion consumer service URL, right?
Okay,
Short
so
ACS URL.
okay, so what is assertion consumer service? Can you explain that one more time?
Sure.
When Okta
So
it back to the application, like answers back. That
yes, so when Okta answers back to the application, Okta provides few statements about the user, right? Or about the authentication. So first thing which Okta says whether the authentication is successful or not, right? So that is one assertion. Secondly, Okta will tell who is the user. So Okta can include 4 or 5 information about you. Can be your first name, last name, email address, phone number, groups you're part of, right? So these are the information which Okta will include. These information are called as assertions, right? So these information will be sent to the application. That's why application is requesting Okta, because application does not have these information about the user. So application is requesting Okta to validate who is the user and provide the information. So once Okta has validated, it will provide these information to the application. These informations are called as assertion, and there has to be some point in application or some place or some URL in application which is ready to accept this information, right? If I send a letter to your address, that address should be valid. There has to be some people to accept that letter from the courier, right? They just cannot drop it and just go and nobody is reading it, right? So it has to be used by someone. It has to be read by someone, and this someone is application. So there has to be a point in application where this can be sent to, and that that URL of the application is called as assertion consumer service. So the job of this assertion consumer service URL of the application is to read the response coming from Okta and find out who is the user, because Okta is providing the user information in the response.
Okay, I had a question.
Mhm.
So Okta's basic like feature when you're adding a person is what you have to have their first name, last name, username, and email, right? So when an application asks or requests to find out the identity, what if that certain application needs more than just first name, last name, email address, and username? Then is that when we use the AD integration, or they'll just have to work with whatever Okta has?
So there are two things. Not just AD, even in Okta, you can specify more information about the user, right? Just not 5. These 5 are basic information which is
Yeah.
required. Other than that, Okta still has a way of supporting more information about the user. So if your application requires more information, That means that information should be available to Okta. If the information is not available to Okta, then you as an Okta administrator has to find a way how you can make this available. So you have to get these information into Okta somehow, whether you get it from AD, from different application, or you manually sit and update it, that's up to you or up to the aggregator, which is the administrator. But this information, if it is a required information for the application, it has to be made available on this response.
Okay, but how will that work when a person is signing themselves up and they don't provide all the information?
Person is signing up themselves where?
Maybe in Okta or maybe even in this application, like if for single sign-on, you have multiple applications you can use for, right? But they didn't
Correct.
add in all the information that maybe some other applications needed. So what would happen at that time then?
So at that point of time, application would not let the user log in. So the user would come back to you saying that I'm not able to log into this application. And you as an admin knows what information this application require. So you can check if user has those information. If not, then you will update it.
Is there a way where we can inform the user that they need to provide it during, well, actually, when they're doing the self-registration, right? For Okta, can we just, we can force them to provide that
Yeah.
information before they
Yeah,
register?
you can definitely force them to provide these information during the sign up itself, right? That's why like every sign up page forces you to provide a username, a password, which is at basic required by all the applications. I may not use your zip address, zip code, or street address, right? But I would definitely need your first name, last name, username. That's the basic information each and every. Missed something. Hold on. The stupid Google. Okay. So there has to be some basic information provided, right? Again, what we consider basic depends upon app to app, right? There can be some app where your phone number is a required information. There will be a lot of apps where phone number is not needed at all, right? So this basic information varies from app to app, and whatever information these app requires, and if user need to access that app, then user need to provide that information. If not through the sign up process, if not through the accumulation process, like importing from Active Directory, even Active Directory, let's say when you create a user in Active Directory, what information do you provide at basic? You only provide their first name, last name, and the username, right? Then other information are optional. Even if you don't provide, you can still create the user, right? So at any point of time, if the user requires an application requires some information, then you have to collect that information from the user. How would you collect it? That will differ. Either you can force the user to provide that information, or you can reach out to the user and gather the information and update it. That's totally a different issue.
So as an administrator, you would need to know what that application is asking for, which features of the user is it's asking for. Every time a person might want to contact you, and you should have this like information ready on hand, right?
Correct. Yeah. So that's a job when you onboard an application or when you integrate an application with Okta. At that point of time, application will tell you, I need these 5 information about a user. So you have to make sure any user who need access to that application provides you those 5 information. Question? Okay, so the last, not the last, but another information which would be there in the response will be the entity ID of the application also. So when this response arrives to the application, application has to know that this response is for this application only. Like when I receive a letter, and if the letter says somebody else's name, then I would not open that letter ethically, right? If I'm ethical, I will not open that letter. I'll just return that letter, right? So that letter has to include the recipient name. And here, that is called as audience. So audience value has to be the name of the application. And we already know we represent the name. The unique way of identifying an application is through their entity ID. So audience will become the entity ID of the application. So once application receives it, if that entity ID is for that application, then application would validate and go ahead with this authentication. And then last is the assertions itself. And assertions means user information and authentication information. Okay, so these are the information which you will find in response. So request is simpler, leaner, 3 information, entity ID, SSO URL, and ACS URL. Response has more information. It first tells who is sending the this response. So it includes the entity ID of identity provider, which is Okta. It includes where to send this information. So it includes the ACS URL of the application. It includes who should be receiving this, the unique name of the application. So it includes audience, entity ID of the application, and it includes user information and the authentication success messages so that app knows that authentication was successful and this is the user. Are we good?
Yeah.
All right, so I would stop the session here today. And again, we would see how we can make this information more granular tomorrow. So today and tomorrow, both would be mostly a theoretical session where you will need to understand the SAML as a tool or a protocol. And then we would start onboarding the application or integrating the application, and you will see the SAML in action.
I had a question. So for the URL, how does the applicant know what URL, SSO URL to use? Like, is there like a standard protocol or something that they have to use?
I didn't get you. Can you repeat once again?
So you know the URLs that you're mentioning, like the destination SSO URL. How does the applicant know which specific URL to use? Like, does Okta provide it, or how do they know?
So when you say applicant, are you referring to the application as an applicant or user as an applicant?
Yeah, like for example, Office, right? So if Office wants to, send a request to Okta, so then how does Office know which specific URL to use?
Yes. So Okta will provide that URL at the time of integration. So integration is a one-time job, right? You integrate one time with an application. At that point of time, you will provide application's information to Okta and Okta's information to the application. So both has to exchange this information with each other.
Okay.
Yeah, and when we do the integration, we'll see how this information exchange is taking place. So you have to share Okta's URL and entity ID and other information with the application and similar information about the application with Okta.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks guys for joining today, and we'll continue our discussion tomorrow. If you want, quickly you can take the screenshot. I'm not sure if I'm going to use the same diagram tomorrow or it may be a different diagram, but I'll try to use the same one if it lets me save somehow.
Sumit, what did you want me to name today's session?
You can say SAML intro.
SAML intro. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Sumit.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day. Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
You too.